In continuing to support the position that the LGBT civil rights movement should make same-sex marriage its top priority, I would first like to address my opponent's fear that such a priority would alienate the transgender community. Logistically speaking, same-sex marriage does a better job of including transgenders than many of the current anti-discrimination laws being lobbied for, which are purely based on sexual orientation and say nothing about gender identity as the transgender community requires. Same-sex marriage, meanwhile, grants them the same right to marry as lesbians, gays, and bisexuals who would benefit, providing them at least a temporary solution to the fact that society often does not recognize the gender they determine for themselves as legitimate. Furthermore, like any movement, the LGBT civil rights movement is going to advance in pieces. Simply by virtue of the fact that they are pieces, they are only going to address certain issues and certain members of the LGBT community at one time. While this may seem unfortunate, experience has taught us that the most effective way to win a war is by winning one battle at a time. Same-sex marriage, meanwhile, is a great battle to start with, because it itself can be broken down into the accomplishments of simpler tasks, namely by introducing legal change at the local and state levels. While legalizing same-sex marriage does not apply to everyone in the LGBT community directly, it does, as I pointed out in my initial argument, apply to each and every member symbolically, by contradicting the idea that marriage is only between a person with male anatomy and a person with female anatomy. It services lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgenders alike. It destroys the notion that marriage outside of this category is abnormal, thus also combating the argument that LGBT individuals in general are abnormal. This, in turn, makes it far more difficult to treat them abnormally, that is, unfairly. In this regard, legalizing same-sex marriage is a victory for the entire LGBT community, and the entire LGBT community could seize upon the momentum resulting from the victory and use it to bring about even greater societal changes, the next pieces of the movement. This is precisely why my opponent's concerns that a large portion of the LGBT community might drop off the civil rights movement upon obtaining legalization of same-sex marriage are largely unfounded. If we look back at the greatest political and social movements in our history, the American Revolution, the abolition movement, the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, no one was ever eager to quit while they were ahead. Escaped slaves, for example, risked their freedom and their lives to help others attain the same liberation. And if one were to argue that people are not willing to fight for things that do not directly benefit them, how does one explain the entire LGBT ally sector who are fighting for LGBT rights simply because they are decent human beings and because they care? My opponent is correct in stating that there are other pressing issues facing the LGBT demographic. However, these issues do not make the legalization of same-sex marriage petty. In fact, they underscore even further the need to address the legalization of same-sex marriage as soon as possible, because this step plays a big role, as I outlined here and in my previous argument, in garnering cultural acceptance for the LGBT community. For this and many other reasons, legalizing same-sex marriage remains a simple and effective measure on which to focus the LGBT civil rights movement.